Good morning, and thank you so much for joining us today for the Professional Development Between the Pages, Historical and Cultural Context. This is for the Big Read program that the Poughkeepsie Public Library District hosts and coordinates on an annual basis. This is our 15th year coordinating the Big Read. And this year's book selection is the graphic novel, the graphic memoir, The Best We Could Do by T. Bowie. And so today we have with us Goretti Benka. Actually, before I introduce her, there's just a little bit more housekeeping I want to mention. I will ask you all to keep your self muted until such time as Goretti asks, invites questions. You can also use the chat for questions at any point throughout the presentation. This will be an hour-long professional development, and I will be able to verify attendance and send that attendance to your district if you do need proof of attendance for credit for professional development. I also want to remind you that we have 3 more professional developments coming up. Today at 11 o'clock, there's one called Teaching the Graphic Novel. And then on Thursday morning at 9:30, we have a professional development called Implicit Bias in the classroom and techniques for discussion of cultural diversity in the classroom. And that will be led by Candice Van Dyke, Chief Diversity Officer at SUNY Ulster. And then another session Thursday at 11 o'clock for led by the Artifact on portraiture and essay writing for in the classroom for memoir, creating interesting visual and written memoir. So I do invite you to check those out. If you need further information, I'll put my contact in the chat. So let me now move on to Goretti Benka. She has been a fantastic resource in the planning process for this year's Big Read. She is director for the Center for Teaching and Learning at SUNY Ulster. She's also an assistant professor of English at SUNY Ulster. She is the child of Vietnamese refugees born in New York City and grew up here in the Hudson Valley. And I want to welcome her and thank her for our presentation this morning. Thank you, Benka. Goretti, you can take over from here. Thank you, Goretti.
Great. Thank you so much, Jewel. Thanks for having me. Can everybody hear me okay? Awesome. Thank you so much. So yes, before I get into the presentation itself, I do want us to take a couple of minutes to do a little bit of reflection. And so one thing that I would like you to do, and you can do this personally on a sheet of paper, you can do this mentally, you can drop your responses in the chat if you'd like. But what I'd like you to do first is just think for a moment. When I say the words Vietnamese, Vietnamese American, Vietnamese refugees, Vietnamese immigrants, what comes to mind for you? When you hear those words, what comes to mind for you personally? Again, feel free to drop that in the chat. You don't have to share if you don't want to. You can keep it personal. But I just want you to reflect on what comes to mind when you hear the words Vietnamese, Vietnamese American, Vietnamese refugee, Vietnamese immigrant. Give you a moment. Okay. Jewel, are there any in the chat that anybody wanted to share? It's okay if nobody did. Um, let's see if I can- okay. So, oh, I can see the chat.
Okay.
I figured it out. Okay, so images from the Vietnam War. Okay, photographs from being, when you're a kid, newspapers after. Okay, yeah, yeah. All right. Now what I'd also like you to think about too is the boat people. Yes, absolutely. What I'd like you to think about for a moment, and again, you don't have to share this, this can be remain personal, but I just want you to reflect on what you think you will bring to your classroom when teaching a work by a Vietnamese writer. What is it that you are able to bring to your students, to your class? What is it that you feel like you can bring to the table when discussing a work by a Vietnamese writer? I'll give you a moment there.
Mm.
Okay. And then finally, one last thing that I'd like you to think about, jot down again on a sheet of paper for yourself. You can drop it in the chat, is what questions do you bring to today's table? What questions do you have that brought you here to this professional development? What do you bring with you that you would like clarity on? And hopefully through my presentation, I will respond to some of those. We will be sure to give you time at the end in case I miss anything. But before we forget, before we get into things, just jot down what brought you here today. What questions do you bring to our table today? Okay. Good. And of course, as we go through the presentation today, if questions come up, feel free to drop them in the chat or jot them down. And like I said, we'll make sure that we leave some time at the end so that we can have some dialogue and bring in those questions so that we can try to get a response for you in some way, or at least a resource for you if I don't have the direct response for you for today. Okay. Alrighty. So I'm going to go ahead and close my chat window, but Jewel, you'll be monitoring the chat for us. So again, if you have any questions or comments, you can drop them in there. Alrighty. So my title for today's presentation is Between the Pages, Using Historical and Cultural Context to Teach Literature. Now, when I teach literature at the college level, oftentimes I approach the literary work with that kind of historical and cultural context, because I really am come from the kind of frame of mind or the pedagogical approach that in order for the students to really be able to understand what's happening in the text, they need to have at least foundational knowledge to bring to the reading, right? And so oftentimes that relies on the students having been exposed to the history or been exposed to the culture. And even though we've become quite a global society, what I personally have been noticing is that students have become more insular in their culture, especially in their pop culture. right? So as technology has allowed us to become quite global, it seems like to a certain degree, there is a limitation in what many students are exposed to. And I have come to the realization that some of that is that with the technology has come the ability to streamline or kind of really box in what we're exposed to, as opposed to before when, for example, we only had 3 channels on our television, right? We were stuck with whatever was on the TV at the time and whatever was being presented to us. And now we're able to have so many options to pick and choose that there are times when we're able to kind of limit what we're exposed to. And therefore, some of that historical and cultural context is not being as widely broadcasted, or at least perhaps disseminated as perhaps before. And so as teachers, one of my kind of goals is to, when I teach the literature, is to incorporate in that historical and cultural context. Oftentimes, I will try to connect with one of my other colleagues from another department so that we can kind of work out some kind of parallel schedule so that we can work on things relatively at the same time so that some of those students can have the benefit of both of those things. So that might be something that some of you may be able to engage with in your schools or your school districts throughout. But so let me just give you a little bit about myself. Alrighty. I am, as Jewel said, an assistant professor of English at SUNY Ulster. I'm also the director of their Center for Teaching and Learning, which means that I primarily oversee professional development opportunities that we host at the campus for our faculty, but also I try to curate as many resources as I can and outside opportunities for our faculty and help them to be able to go to conferences or present at conferences and things like that. And of course, a lot of things have been virtual this last couple, year and a half or so. So there's been a lot of webinars and workshops very similar to what we're doing here today. But I'm also a first generation Vietnamese American, right? So my mother escaped Saigon as a refugee in April of 1975, and I was born in New York City in 1975. And I don't give those years or those dates to reveal my age, because I certainly have gotten to that point where I really don't want to reveal my age anymore. But it is significant to understand and place me in this kind of historical and cultural conversation. And I'm sure that you know that when it comes to Vietnamese culture, 1975 is a poignant year for the Vietnamese people. And so I was raised here in the Mid-Hudson Valley. I went to school locally. I went to school in High Park, and then I went to Our Lady of Lourdes High School before going to Dutchess Community College for a year. And then I went away for my undergraduate, and then I returned and I worked in the Hudson Valley in a number of locations. And then I decided I wanted to go back to grad school. So I did my grad work at SUNY New Paltz. And that's where I was able to start my college teaching career through the teaching assistant program there. And it's important to understand my perspective in all of this is that I was raised in both a traditional and assimilated home. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means, especially for Vietnamese Americans in this particular day and age, right? So growing up in the 80s and the 90s, here in the US, here in New York, here in the Hudson Valley, but having a foot in both worlds, so to speak. And so we'll talk a little bit more about what that means a little bit later on. But before we get into some of that, I do want to just give you some very basic general information, some background information, give you some basic cultural context in regards to Vietnamese culture as a whole, and then kind of taking that into the immigrant experience and also the first and second generation experience, because I think that that's what some of you will be encountering both in the literature, but also perhaps even with some of your students in your classrooms as well. All righty. So I just want to, so far, so good. Anything in the chat, Jewel, that needs to be addressed so far? We're good? Awesome. Alrighty. So some just very generic information that I think maybe some of you already are familiar with, perhaps, and maybe some of you are not. I'm just going to move my Zoom window here a little bit. So one thing that's really important to understand is that Vietnamese culture as a whole is kind of a fusion of influences from Southeast Asian countries, especially the Chinese, and then also French culture from the occupation and other European influences through the French, and then a socialist philosophy, ideology, as well as political system. Okay. Ethnicity and language is often regionalized. So when you talk to someone who's Vietnamese, potentially, although as Americans, we often associate them with a city, either Hanoi or Saigon, or now Ho Chi Minh City in the south, right? Hanoi is in the north and Saigon is in the south. But there are many, many different regions of Vietnam. And within the Vietnamese people, the ethnicity is based on the region. So there are the mountain people, there are the Delta people, and then, or the river people, and then there are the folks who come from the city. And the language is also regionalized, right? So when we talk about the Vietnamese language, very much like American English, right, where we have all of these kind of dialects and accents, the Vietnamese language also has that kind of regionalization, where if you are from the north, your accent is very very pronounced and your pronunciations are quite different than if you're from the south, than if you're from the mountains, if you're from the Delta. So you know, oftentimes there is a little bit of that kind of ethnic kind of pride, but also, you know, sometimes there's some ethnic tensions between Vietnamese people as well, right? So it's very common to just kind of lump Vietnamese people all into this kind of stereotype, but understanding that depending on where the family comes from, their language may be a little bit different than other Vietnamese people that you may have met or know, and even some of their traditions and kind of rituals may also be quite different. All right. It is very common that family is central to the lifestyle. You'll often have multi-generational households, and that has come to the US as well. We still see that today here in the US. We'll see, you know, a child bring in their parent or even a grandparent. And there's also a certain level of expectation from the elders as well. So multi-generational households and that very kind of family-centric lifestyle is quite common. And we'll talk a little bit more about that too. Religion is also often a very important part of the lifestyle of a Vietnamese family. There is a number of different religions, primarily Buddhism, Catholicism, or Christianity, and Taoism are kind of the most common, but there are some other variations and other religions that are practiced throughout Vietnam. Again, some of that is quite regionalized as well. Ancestral worship is still quite common, and that comes in degrees of variation, right? But oftentimes, if you enter a Vietnamese family's home, there will be an ancestral altar, right? And it can be just simply some, you know, pictures of those who have passed with some candles, some flowers, sometimes even some fruit. Maybe some of you have seen this in different establishments that you've gone into. You may have seen those things too. Those altars are, you know, a very sacred spot for those folks. This is not ancestor worship in the sense of a religion, but rather it kind of goes back to that family centric mentality that even in death, we still revere and respect the elders and those who have passed and those who have come before us. So those elements that revolve around the family, that integrate religion, those are really keystones to understanding the Vietnamese culture and the Vietnamese people, because it is something that is at the heart of really who they are in many ways. And although as the generations have become more assimilated into in the American culture, there are still, you'll still see, pretty predominant remnants of these traditions in kind of the lifestyle that they live. Even the younger folks will still kind of gravitate a little bit back, even though as much as they try to push away or run away from those traditional ways. And education is held in the highest regard, right? Some folks have heard the term tiger mom, right? Where children are pushed to their absolute limits in terms of academic study, as well as often extracurricular activities, primarily in the arts, thinking about primarily musical instruments and things like that, but even visual arts of any kind. Education is so important, especially to immigrant parents. And we see this amongst many different types of ethnicities, but in the Vietnamese culture, and it does tie into both the idea of class as well as social acceptance or social reflection of the family. And then, of course, also here in America, that idea of the American dream, being able to achieve a higher level of the previous generation, and being able to show good face to the rest of the family and as well as the community. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second too. Right. So far, any questions, thoughts? Oh, I do see something. Let me see. Yes, I absolutely can share the slides, as well as and I know Jules said that the recording will be shared, but I can also share the slides as well. Okay, so just really quick about geography, again, just to kind of set that contents, that foundation for you to go into teaching these literary works with kind of an understanding of where the people come from and how that influences what's happening in the story and the characters that evolve out of the story. But just very generally, if you look at the country itself, and I know somebody mentioned about trying to picture the map when they hear that word, I still do too, even though I have a wooden one on my wall, I still, envision that. You'll notice that it is an S-shaped. It's bordered by China, Laos, and Cambodia. So very fixed in that Southeast Asian location. The tropical climate obviously affects crops. You have rice, bamboo, you have a lot of tropical fruits. Again, thinking about the regions, right? You have that coastal, then you have the river deltas, and then you have the mountains. And oftentimes folks from the different regions will be quite territorial, so to speak, right? In their language, in their traditions, in their costume, the way that they dress. All of those things are very much a part of who they are, not just their geographical location. So it is kind of important to understand that when you're working with the literature, oftentimes it's taken for granted. And I think some of the works that you're working with don't deal too much with that. But if you continue to study Vietnamese literature in any way, you'll start to see that become more predominant. Right now, as we speak, in terms of geography and politics, right? The Socialist Republic of Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh City is what used to be Saigon in the south, right? And Hanoi in the north is considered its capital. Okay, so understand too, depending on where you teach and who you have in your classrooms, you may come across parents or grandparents of students who are pretty sensitive about the change in the name of the city in Saigon in the south, the fact that Hanoi is the capital now. Those things may, we use that term triggered, right? It may trigger some folks. It may be a sensitivity. We'll talk about, the Vietnamese people as individuals and their reactions to things, but just understand that even if they don't say anything, even if they don't, express any kind of sensitivity to that, just know that it may be a little bit bothersome. So again, I mean, it's something that is just kind of, having that cultural context and having that understanding can help you to be a bit more sympathetic or empathetic, and to just be aware of the perceptions that can be present when talking about some of these things. All right. So family. If you if you have a Vietnamese student in your classroom, you probably, or you probably already know how significant the family is. It is the epicenter of life for many Vietnamese, for the majority of the Vietnamese. Traditions, especially around holidays, are key, right? They are very tied into their ways of doing things. They will go back no matter how many generations out you are, you will still do the things. And I still, to this day, I want my red envelopes at New Year's. At that, I want my red envelope. So I will go visit all of the elders to get my red envelopes. We'll talk about what that means in a second. But loyalty, right? Loyalty to the family, priority of the family over individuals is really significant. And you'll see this in the literature. You may see this in your students or your families if you have any Vietnamese American families in your schools. The priority will always be what is the good of the family and what will allow the family to show good face. And I've said that a few times. I don't know if folks understand that term, right? But showing face is basically means that you want to put your best foot forward, right? As we say in the US, you don't ever do anything that would embarrass your family, disgrace your family. And if you do, that is the sin above all sins. So everything revolves around the family in some way. And if you do anything to disgrace that, it is kind of the mark of Cain, so to speak. Children always show respect to elders, regardless of age. So I am 40 years old, right? And I still, when I enter a room of relatives, I must go to the eldest relative first and greet that relative and work my way down the line of seniority, so to speak, right? And then, then I get to get in line, and then my children and my nieces and my nephews and all of the younger kids come through as well. There's a very kind of traditional, very strict way of doing things, and many families still adhere to this. As Americanized or as assimilated as many of these families are, they still do. My children still do it as well when they when they see their grandparents or their aunts and uncles. They've been just raised in that mentality of thinking. And so in a school environment, you may see this as with the children, you may see this as they'll show reverence to the teacher in the sense that they won't ask questions, they won't disagree, they won't question anything, right? They are waiting for the teacher, who is the elder, who is the one who's supposed to be most respected, to tell them what it is that they're supposed to know, what it is that they're supposed to say, what is the right answer, so to speak. So oftentimes it takes a little bit to get them to do any kind of like real inference or critical thinking, or any kind of like self motivated kind of response. They want to just give you as the teacher what it is that you think is the right answer. You'll also see that sometimes they will be afraid to ask questions too, right? So if they don't understand something, or they didn't get it the first time you explained it, and so they need you to slow down, or they need you to repeat it, they often won't, because that would be a sign of disrespect to you, because that would be an example of you doing something wrong. You didn't teach it, at the pace that they needed. So oftentimes they won't say anything, and then they'll either try to figure it out at home, or they'll try to find out some other way. So just kind of, a cultural note on that. It's expected that the younger generation will care for the elders. So again, that idea of the multi-generational home, one that we've been seeing, more and more here in the United States in general. Now we have that, what we've been calling the sandwich generation, right? Those folks who are taking care of children and their parents. This isn't new for a Vietnamese family. This was always kind of the expectation. You were cared for by your parents. And so as they get older, you care for them and that cycle goes on. So I've told my children they will be taking care of me, right? Most households are patriarchal in many respects, right? The husband will go out and work. Typically, the wife will stay home and care for the children and care for the home. But there are certain matriarchal elements to the culture that's kind of interesting. Many families, the mother will take care, or the wife will take care of the finances, right? They may not work out of the home, but they control a lot of the finances. Oftentimes, it is the maternal side's name that is taken for the family. It is, so we're used to the westernized paternal side being taken. In many, many families, the maternal name is the name that's carried on. But there are, even to this day, a certain level of things like arranged marriages or, predetermined marriages, agreements amongst families, things like that. So there are still a lot of, again, that kind of idea of, one foot in the old world and one foot in the new world kind of mentality. Even again, as the generations kind of grow, we're starting to see that separation a little bit more as we continue on, as we get further away from the 1980s and the 1990s. But you still see a lot of that. And so you may encounter that in your with your students or with your families in your school. But yeah, and family is community, right? So your community in a Vietnamese, household is family first, and then extended family if they're around, and then other Vietnamese community members, and then anyone outside of that. Again, it's one of those things that is constantly evolving. We're seeing that those kind of ethnic centric communities still exist. They still are passed on, but a lot of the younger generations, so I'm talking the ones who are, like very young, preteens, teenagers, they're starting to move away from that a little bit more. One, especially in the Hudson Valley, because we don't have as high of a Vietnamese community as some of the larger cities like New York, LA, San Diego, some of those other larger cities, even down in Texas. There are still full communities of Vietnamese families that just, they're very tight knit. They stay within themselves for a large part of their lives. And then, perhaps if the younger generation goes off to college or moves away, then we start to see that start to disperse a little bit. But we're still seeing large pockets of that all across the country, in especially the bigger cities, not so much in the mid Hudson Valley. Any questions so far? You good? All right. So food, because this is my favorite subject. I don't know about you all, but when we talk about food and when you see food being talked about in some of the literary works, we often see this juxtaposition between the traditional Vietnamese food, and especially in the Vietnamese American literary works, we see that juxtaposition between American food versus Vietnamese food. And typically, what we see is this idea that the Vietnamese want to assimilate. They want that kind of connection with their new culture, with their new world, with their new country. But realizing that so much of who they are is kind of built into the foods that they prepare and the foods that they eat, because it has so much historical and cultural relevance, right? So much of the food is rooted in not only the kind of historical influences over the centuries, right, by the Chinese, by the French, but also too, so much of their, especially at the holidays, so many of their traditions, so much of their kind of family communion, that family gathering, that getting together, is rooted in food, right? And so for many Vietnamese immigrants and subsequent generations, the juxtaposition between the foods is often representing that tension, that again, going back to that one foot in the old world, one foot in the new world, and being able to try to find that balance, right? But when we talk about Vietnamese food in general, Vietnamese cuisine, we're talking about rice or noodle based dishes, right? With a lot of vegetables. Traditional dishes have minimal animal protein. It's a lot of vegetables. It's a lot of rice or noodles, and then some either pork or beef or fish, chicken to supplement the protein. But typically, if you were to eat as a true Vietnamese, and not like in a touristy restaurant or something like that, you would have a very small portion of the animal protein and much more of the vegetables and even some fruit. Savory dominates over sweet flavor profiles. You won't see a lot of, again, that's the other juxtaposition, right? American foods tend to be represented as very sweet, very almost like focusing on like our treat foods or our junk foods, whereas the Vietnamese tend to stick to the savory. Even the desserts, the quote unquote desserts, those that are those that are really traditional, they tend to be more savory and very minimal sugar. It's more of the desserts that are French based, the creme brulees and things like that that have a lot of the sugar, the high sugar content. But etiquette and manners are quite ritualistic. So if you, but also at the same time, not exactly the same as Western etiquette, right? So when we're dining with traditional Vietnamese, right, picking up your bowl and kind of scooping the rice or the noodles in with your chopsticks is not deemed impolite, right? That's considered to be the proper way to eat it, because there would be less waste if you were trying to use your chopsticks to bring rice up from your bowl sitting at the table, as we would normally eat as westernized folks or Americans, right? The potential of dropping food would be there, and most traditional Vietnamese look down on wasting food because of the history of famine and poverty. So when you look at the etiquette and manners, they are both ritualistic in the sense that there are so many rules, right? There are things you should not do, lots of things you should not do. Everything from, the youngest should not pick up a chopstick and put a drop of food in their mouth before the elders begin to eat, right? So if the elders are talking, and as they are wont to do, right, and food would be in front of them, and if they're talking and they're still talking and they haven't started eating yet, you as a child would still sit there and look at the food and sit there and wait until they started eating. And if you picked up your chopstick before they did, you were done. You were excused from the table, so to speak. You showed the utmost disrespect to your elders, and so you could go eat in the kitchen by yourself. So lots of ritualistic things that are and even today we still see them pretty commonly, but at the same time, not always exactly the same as what we would deem as to be good manners in Western culture, right? So I remember one of the things that I experienced was we went out to dinner with some American friends that my mom had met through work, and my mom was a Beamer. I'm a Beamer kid, by the way. So my mom worked for IBM for 30 years. I grew up in the Hudson Valley as a Beamer kid, and we went out to dinner with a bunch of some work people, and and a cousin of ours was with us, and he let out this like giant burp at the table. And I could see, now I was raised in the US, clearly. I mean, you can tell by the way I talk. I have no accent. I can barely speak any Vietnamese. I can't read any. I can still understand it. So when people are talking about me, I know. But I was mortified. I was mortified because I am this American born assimilated kid, and all of the white folks at the table were mortified, right? And my cousin was like, "What? Like, it was a good meal." Um, and that because burping was a sign that you enjoyed your meal. It was a hearty meal, and it was like compliments to the chef. So understanding those differences in etiquette and manners is really significant, especially when teaching the literature, because oftentimes you'll see characters behave in a way that is antithetical to what we deem as good manners, right? What is that? Mrs. Post, right? She was the etiquette lady in the newspapers back in the day, right? She would have frowned upon that quite highly, but that's not the case. So when we talk about meals, right? When we see meals in the literature, that is the epicenter there, right? Because oftentimes it's family around the table, you know, enjoying the meal. And if it's not, that's significant, right? If family is not you know, partaking in a meal together, if the meal is broken up in some way, if there's talk about American food versus Vietnamese food, or this is the big one, rejecting the Vietnamese food for the American food, right? Heaven forbid I told my mother I wanted a McDonald's cheeseburger over, you know, a bowl of pho for dinner one day. Like, I'm done, right? I wouldn't eat for a week. No, I'm only joking. But, you know, that was like, you know, the biggest insult to my mother would be to say, no, I don't want your cooking. I want to go and get a burger at McDonald's, or I want to go to, you know, Denny's for dinner, right? That's the biggest insult, right? So when you see food in the literature, when characters are talking about food, or when they're partaking in a meal, that's a communion, right? That's a communal experience. That's an experience that's being shared, for better or for worse, depending on what's happening, right? But food is, you know, often at the epicenter of life, because it is not only nourishing in the physical sense, but oftentimes this is where the emotional nourishment can take place too, right? All right. Any questions so far? Are we good? Okay. I'm not going to. Oh,
there was
yes.
one quick question here about, well, two actually, sorry.
Yeah.
What influences whether the maternal or paternal last name is selected for the family, as well as do you find the Vietnamese food offered in restaurants in the Hudson Valley to be authentic?
Oh, okay. The choice of names, again, regional to a certain degree. Sometimes it has to do with class as well. So generally speaking, especially in kind of the bigger cities, you would see the paternal name being taken because of the westernized influence, you know, the European influences and things like that. When you got out into like the country, the Delta, into the mountains, some of it was regional, some of it was class, but you would often find that the family would take the maternal side's name, or the wife's name. So that was kind of, but you'll notice that especially in the bigger cities, you'll see the paternal name being taken, as we are accustomed to in the West. That's a loaded question about the food, the restaurants around here. We have a number of pretty good restaurants here. It's hard because here's the thing, right? And this is true in a lot of other cultures, right? Nothing beats mom's cooking, right? Nothing beats home cooking. And at the same time, most moms don't like anybody else's cooking, right? So I would say that the Vietnamese restaurants that are in the area are good. They are fairly authentic. I will say that they have catered to the American palate. to a degree, right? And the folks who run kind of more American style restaurants that include Vietnamese dishes, you know, kind of that fusion approach, you know, it's all right. But yeah, I think if you go to any of the Vietnamese restaurants, you'll get a good meal. You'll get a pretty authentic meal. But if you ever get an opportunity to eat a home cooked meal, you'll also see though too the regional variations as well. So pho in the north and pho in the south. I use pho as an example because I think that that's probably the most common Vietnamese dish that the majority of folks are familiar with. But even the banh mi, right? The banh mi, the sandwich, is regionalized in the sense that it is very, very European in influence, right? But even the contents, what you put inside, the different meats and things like that, would be dependent on where you're from in the country. So, you know, and what we get here in the States is you know, is okay, right? I mean, if you get down to like Chinatown or if you get up to Albany, there's a shop, and some of those foods are pretty closer to authenticity, but it's hard sometimes to get ingredients. It's hard sometimes to just get that, you know, right flavor profile. So, you know, unless you want to hop a plane, it's harder to get some of the really authentic meals. But any of the bigger cities, you know, if you get down to Texas, if you get out to California, you'll get some really, you know, you'll get pretty close to a really authentic meal and authentic experience as well, which is kind of interesting too sometimes. Any other questions? Great questions. Awesome. Just very quickly moving on, I'm not going to go into a lot of the history of the Vietnam War itself. I think so much has already been done. There's lots of resources out there. National Geographic Kids, I think, does a pretty decent website on the war and being able to teach the war to younger children. But some just things to note, kind of keep in the back of your mind when you're approaching the literature, when you're engaging with Vietnamese immigrants or Vietnamese Americans, subsequent generations. The U.S. involvement began as an advisory role, right? You'll notice the dates of the war itself. The Civil War itself was a kind of a very elongated thing, right? I mean, you have a whole generation basically of people who grew up in the state of war, right? And so when the U.S. became involved, it was on an advisory role, and then there was an attack on a ship, and that's when the U.S. kind of amped up their involvement. We know that there were many Americans here in the U.S. that did not agree with the U.S.'s involvement in the war, and so that created that tension. That tension intensified once Saigon fell. The Vietnamese immigrants sought safety around the world, and many came to the United States to escape persecution and arrest by the communist government, right? So when the US cities started to accept the refugees all across the country, you had kind of this diametrical opposition, right? Where on the one hand, you had folks who wanted to accept the refugees in to, you know, allow them, you know, a place of safety and a place to be able to start their lives again after their country was taken over by a communist regime. And then you had the folks who were quite upset about that, right? There was this kind of anti-Vietnamese sensibility, so to speak. We saw that all across the US in various degrees. But that affects the immigrants and the subsequent generations in the sense that it caused that particular generation of Vietnamese to really kind of want to lay low, to fly under the radar, to not be identified, right? Some would even go as far as to, you know, if somebody said, "Oh, you're Chinese," they'd say, "Yeah, yes, I am," right? Because at that point, Chinese culture and Chinese people were, or Chinese descent, were much more accepted in the US than a Vietnamese immigrant, right? And so they were very much willing to just kind of not shake, not rock the boat, not draw any attention to themselves, just kind of try to assimilate as best they could. So then what we see then is with the Vietnamese Americans, we get kind of a very interesting kind of situation where my generation, which is I was born in the US in 1975, so I am an American citizen. I have never been to Vietnam. My ability to speak Vietnamese is very minimal because growing up, my mother was adamant that I did not speak Vietnamese in the home. I was to learn English. I was to speak English, and at school and at home, because one, that would allow me to grow up without an accent, which, and it also helped her to learn English as well. So me and my sisters were not allowed to speak Vietnamese at home. She, however, though, had to speak Vietnamese to us because she barely spoke any English at all. So we were her translator to a certain degree. We were the ones who had to take care of a lot of like the household business, right? So if like if a solicitor called or somebody came to the door, or you had to take care of something with a bill, my sister and I would take care of that because we were the ones who spoke English fluently. And we were also the ones who were helping her to learn the language as well, because she would speak to us in Vietnamese and we would respond in English, right? And then we would kind of like mix in a little bit of Vietnamese here or there so that she could understand what we were saying. And that's basically, how I talked for the majority of my childhood, right? And same things with interacting with other relatives. We would speak English to them and they would speak Vietnamese to us. So there is a lot of that tension that still is present in a lot of families, especially here in the Mid-Hudson Valley. And then we are now starting to see the younger generation really moving away as my generation is having children. Many of us have married interracially, right? My husband is Polish from Western New York. So I didn't, so I have like kind of even further moved my children away from like kind of the old world ways of doing things, right? But there is still kind of that generational tension that's happening, right? Where the elders are still very much kind of rooted in a lot of the old world ways of doing things. Their ethnicity is still kind of rooted in that. Their language is still rooted in that, although they have done whatever they could to assimilate as much as possible. And there's still that kind of family loyalty that is deemed of the utmost importance. Younger generations to a certain degree are still expected to care for their elders. Though, again, as we see the generations evolve, we're starting to see a little bit of that start to dissipate. But there's, this idea of being able to allow the next generation to do better and to push them to be much better than the previous generation. That's really at the heart of what is happening. And so we see a lot of that in literature. We see a lot of that kind of tension. We see some of that guilt too, where many of the elders feel really guilty about kind of what they see as turning their backs on their culture and on their country, in order for their children to be successful in this new country, in order for their children to be able to really be an integral part of American culture. There's a certain level of guilt of turning their back on the old world or the old country, and the old customs. There is, still this kind of, we talk about the American dream, and when we talk about American literature, right, it's such a predominant theme in American literature. Well, in Vietnamese American literature, it is also, and it's still something that is strive for. There's so much of that idea that the next generation will do better, the next generation, and the first way to do that is first through education, right? You have to get a good education. You have to do really well in school. And there's that pressure to be all of those things. We're starting to see a little bit of a kind of a curve where things are, I don't know if it's our era or our time or what is it, but that nostalgia for the old. And so we see a lot of kind of the millennials looking back and trying to pull some of that old culture back in. There are some young folks who are trying to learn Vietnamese now, even though they were never taught it before. So there's a lot of tension, and there's some tension between the communities as well, right? Vietnamese Americans tend to stay in these tight-knit communities, but they also, there's tension when somebody doesn't conform, right? So if if somebody doesn't do the thing that they're supposed to do, if they don't behave the way that they're supposed to, there's this constant like push and pull between also the generations, but also kind of those who feel like they should maintain their ethnicity and have that Vietnamese pride. And then there are others who are like, we need to be American. We need to adopt all of the American things. We need to do all of the American, ways. And, occasionally we'll celebrate that, and, we'll give out red envelopes, and we'll have, Vietnamese food, for the holidays or something like that. So there is a lot of that, and that's constantly evolving. And we see that all in the literature. We see that in, our community and in our neighbors. So, all right. So this was my closing slide here, because I think it is representative of all of the things, right? You have the traditional ao dai, which is the women's dress. It's the tunic with the flowy pants underneath. If you were still in Vietnam, you would have your everyday ao dai, and then you would have your really fancy kind of formal wear. But then, it's been so westernized at this point. You wear your Levi jeans or your capri shorts or your yoga pants and what have you. The food is still predominant, I think, and especially now that it's gotten kind of globally, more accepted as a cuisine. You have chefs that are trying to make it more gourmet all the time, which is kind of funny because honestly, Vietnamese food is not really meant to be gourmet, although there's a lot of French influence. It's people food. It's food that you want to come around the table with your family and eat, and it's not it's not meant to be super fancy. It's meant to be enjoyed, right? But then you still have those traditions that we still practice, right? Like this is a picture of a red envelope for Thut, which is our New Year's. Elders will put money in it and give it out to the children. And that's all of us, we still look for our red envelopes every year. But you have that younger generation that's moving on. They kind of have that national or ethnic pride, but they want to move on. They want to be a part of that global community, that global social realm, right? That technology and social media and all of the things that our modern world has brought to us, that has brought us all together. They want to be a part of that world, and they don't want to fly under the radar anymore. They don't want to kind of hide in the shadows anymore. They want to be accepted for who they are in their duality sometimes, right? But they want to be able to be recognized and not have to be silenced anymore. So, and I think we're seeing that a lot with the literature that we're seeing coming out lately. So I thank the Poughkeepsie Library for doing this particular novel and the other works that are associated with it with Vietnamese writers, because this is helping the Vietnamese community have a voice that for so long they haven't had, because of racial tensions, because of the history of the Vietnam War, because of just this kind of feeling of not wanting to be confrontational, not wanting to be outed or in the spotlight in a negative way. It was just very much, just kind of assimilate into the community. All right. So I think at this point we have questions. I see the chat light has lit up, and I think we have some good time here to have some good discussion and answer some questions.
So Janice has a couple of thoughts. She appreciates your insights into how Vietnamese American students' understanding of their teachers as elders often changes their approach as learners. Any suggestions on how to help these students feel more comfortable with asking questions and or participating without making the students feel stressed?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will tell you, like, when I was a kid, and again, I grew up in the Hudson Valley. So I went to some of the schools that you all teach at, I think, at some point. And I think that having a comfortable space, right? Having a space where the learning community is at the epicenter of things is really important. And I think we've gotten better at that as teachers and as educators in general, right? We've kind of moved away from that banking method of I am the teacher, I stand up in front of the room and I just tell you what you need to know and you absorb it, which was, that was my generation of education. I think we've gotten better at creating learning communities. And so I think that if we continue to do that, continue to help all students, right, just feel more comfortable asking questions and oftentimes maybe even asking them to come talk to you privately, right? Because sometimes that is a way to allow them to not feel like they're publicly doing something wrong. Just letting them know that, you just want to chat with them, that you want to just see how they're doing. But if you do that as a whole, right, if that's just part of the routine of your classroom, then it's not singling out a student either, right? So if it's just kind of like having those conversations with all of your students, and also, I think sometimes just honestly, right? Just saying and acknowledging, I know that some of you don't like asking questions. I know that some of you are uncomfortable asking questions, but it's okay to ask questions. You're not going to hurt my feelings. You're not going to make me feel like I didn't do a good job. You're not going to be disrespectful to me. It's important to ask questions. And I think that if we continue to build those types of empathetic learning communities, that'll start to dissipate some of that too. And of course, yeah.
Now, Amy says the value of elders needs to be ingrained in the American culture.
Mhm.
Good lesson from our Vietnamese friends. Janice also asks if you have any other resource suggestions for teaching students about the Vietnam War at the elementary level.
I can look up some more for you. The only reason why I know about the Nat Geo one for kids is because one of my kids came home with it from school, but I can look it up for you. I think that there probably is some. I know that the teachers pay teachers, that resource. I know that I haven't seen all of it, but I've kind of seen like bits and pieces here and there. And they have some good things too. It is, war in of itself is a hard thing to teach young kids, but I think that when we focus on like understanding culture and understanding the differences in cultures and becoming more accepting of that, I think then you can kind of bring in a little bit about the conflict of the Civil War piece of it, just like what we would teach any other historical war, like the Civil War, the Revolutionary War. We kind of just small bits and pieces. But if we focus on culture, we focus on the people and who they are and how they live, I think that would be a really good kind of entry point into talking about a war or a conflict like that. But I will look for you and I'll get them to Jewel, and Jewel can probably find a good spot to place them.
Yeah, the Poughkeepsie Public Library District website has a big read page that we are building a resource list of interviews and lesson plans, and some of the books the authors actually have created lesson plans to go with them. So we are in the process of building that now. So if you go to the big read page and you click on the book that you're teaching, there should be within a week or two, I think, a good list of resources.
That's great. Yeah. And it's so funny that somebody said something about Americans being more respectful of their elders. it's an interesting perspective, right? Because it's funny to think about when I look at my kids and my kids' generation and I compare it to ours. Of course, we do that whole like, my generation, we were much more respectful than that generation, right? And I see I have a teenage son and then I have two younger sons, and I see the cousins and stuff like that. And I see where there is starting to be this kind of disconnect a little bit, right? This like it's not as I don't want to say that it's the American influence, because I don't think it's just the American influence, but it is this like more focus on the individual as opposed to the family as a priority over individualism. And I think that that's, again, I kind of tend to lean towards, is that the social media and technology influence more than just an Americanized influence. But I think it's more of a I think it's becoming more of a global problem than our elders would like it to be, right? Because it's funny though. But yeah, any other questions or thoughts? I'd love to hear from folks.
Well, there's several thank yous.
Oh, you're very welcome. Yeah. The boat people question. I think I have to say, for me personally, growing up and my generation, I think that term boat people is a little cringy.
Yeah.
However, our parents use that term all the time. Now, our parents also use other terms that they probably shouldn't in public spaces also. So I would say that term is kind of, and I'm not one to censor language either. Like I'm very much like there's power in language and there's reasons why we use those words. I think it depends on context. I really think that it depends on how you're using the term. When you're teaching about the refugees, they were called boat people. And so I think there's value in teaching. I think there's value in teaching that aspect of it, right? That they were called the boat people because they literally escaped on boats, right? And thinking about the hardship of being, like trying to cram as many people as you possibly could on a little boat to get to Cambodia in hopes that Cambodia will let you in. And let you stay there for a little while until you could figure out how to get to another country, because Cambodia would not let you stay there. They would let you, maybe if it was a good day, they would let you stop there and there was refugee camps there. But if they felt like that was getting too out of control, they would just stop letting people in. And so then you need to, bye Amy. Then it's, are you going to like just kind of drift off into the sea, like what, so there is value in teaching the words that were used and why they were used, and then perhaps why it could be a bit offensive to, or at least uncomfortable for others of a different generation for different reasons, right? When we heard broke people as kids, we were like, oh God, like really, like don't. Not because it was, not because of anything other than it highlighted a really difficult and negative part of our history, that did sometimes lead to racial discrimination. But yeah, so yes and no.
Thank you for that. That's a great explanation.
Yeah. Other questions? I see. I'm trying to get through.
Well, I do think we need to wrap it up.
Okey-doke. Yeah.
So,
so if anybody does have any questions, I can put my, what I'll do, I'll put my email into the chat for you. So you can always shoot me an email, benka@sunyulster.edu. That's my email. So if you have any questions, as you're starting to lesson plan, as you actually get into the teaching, sometimes those questions come up or after the fact. If your students have questions, I'm happy to try to answer anything that I can. If anybody needs a follow-up, type of PD thing, I'm happy to do that as well. But just thinking about, when you're starting to think about this, just think about what I asked you earlier is, what are you bringing to the table, right? What are the things that you potentially are bringing to the table that might perpetuate a bias or, some kind of like stereotype? And what can you bring that would actually maybe help to inform and expand the perception of, what this is? Because, and I know nobody said it, but I know everybody was thinking about it, right? Like Vietnamese people are more than nail salons and restaurants, right? And that's really what it comes down to, is understanding the historical and cultural influences that make up who the Vietnamese community are today, right? And especially here in the Mid-Hudson Valley, because there, aren't very many of us. And even I am kind of like one of those folks who are like the outlier, because I am not part of that tight-knit community. I don't speak Vietnamese. I don't read Vietnamese. And I married a white guy. So, and I teach American literature, for heaven's sakes. Like, I don't even teach Vietnamese literature. Like, my goodness, what is wrong with me? But all right. Well, if anybody has any questions, let me know. I know that there's an 11 o'clock. I'm actually going to hop on the 11 o'clock one too, but you can always email me. And thank you so much for giving me the time and joining today.
All right. Thank you
Thank
all.
you.
Really appreciate you joining. And I will send you the recording when it's ready. And we'll try to keep giving you as much information and updates on book arrivals. They should be arriving any day. So we'll get them out to the schools. And thank you so much for participating in this year's Big Read. Thank you, Goretti. This has been terrific. All right.